There are structures a man builds that he forgets by the following spring. The dimensions blur. The family's name blurs. You remember, maybe, that the sill plates gave you trouble, or that the ridge beam was a foot short and you had to send back to the mill. But the structure itself, the particular combination of weight and material and purpose that made it what it was, that fades. You move on to the next one. You have to. A carpenter who grieves every building he leaves behind would not last long in this profession and would be useless company besides. But there are other structures you carry with you the rest of your life, the way you carry a scar, not painfully, not always, but present. Always reminding you of something true about the world that you hadn't understood before you touched it. I am 78 years old. I have built barns and schoolhouses, root cellars and church belfries, grain elevators, and at least 2 small bridges over creeks that did not strictly require bridging, but whose owners had opinions about the matter. I have worked in 14 counties across Montana and a reach of northern Wyoming that couldn't quite decide which territory it belonged to. I have forgotten more buildings than most men build in a lifetime. But I have not forgotten Nora Alderdice's lambing room. My granddaughter has a notepad on her knee and a look on her face that suggests she expects me to begin with something else, the Halverson Granary perhaps, or the Methodist Church at Rosebud that took 11 weeks and a great deal of argument about the belfry. Those are respectable buildings. They are in the county records. People have been married in the church and grain has been stored in the granary, and both structures are still standing, which is more than I can say for a good many things I built in the first decade of my working life. But I find I cannot start there. I find, if I'm being honest about it, that I can only start in one place. So, I will tell you about a room I did not build. I came to it on an April morning in 1891. One rafter to repair, $1.50 for the work, and coffee so strong it made my back teeth ache. That was the whole of my involvement, practically speaking. One afternoon, one cracked rafter. I was in and out before the sun moved off the south wall of the shed. And yet here I am, 40 years later, with the snow coming down outside this window and 3 families in the valley already reported to have lost stock to the early freeze. And it is Nora Alderdice's lambing room I keep thinking about. It is her room I want to talk about, her room that seems, in a winter like this one, with cold settling in the way cold settles when it means to stay, like the thing most worth saying. So I will say it, you have to understand the country first. Not Montana in the general sense, the mountains and the rivers and the scenery that the railroad advertisements were so fond of in those years. I mean the specific country. The bench land above the Powder River in Custer County, which is a different proposition entirely from the scenery in the advertisements. It is high and open, and the grass is good in the draws and on the south-facing slopes, good enough for sheep and cattle both if you manage it with sense. The sky is large in a way that takes getting used to, larger than the sky has any practical reason to be, pressing down on the land from every direction at once. In August, the light has a quality that makes even a plain building look like something worth preserving. In January, that same light turns pale and flat, and offers no warmth whatsoever, which is the land's way of reminding you that beauty and survival are not the same conversation. The wind in that country is not like eastern wind. Eastern wind gusts. It comes and goes, gives you a moment's relief, changes its mind. The wind on the Montana high plains sustains. It is a pressure rather than an event, a continuous westerly force that in the worst months never fully stops, only varies in the degree of its insistence. Old-timers who had been there since the territorial days had a vocabulary for what the wind did to a person over time, and none of the words in that vocabulary were gentle ones. The cold, when it came in layers. The first layer was uncomfortable. The second was dangerous. The third, and in certain winters there was a third, was of a different category entirely. It was the kind of cold that killed cattle where they stood in the field, that buried homesteads under drifts high enough to step onto a roof without a ladder, that made the space between a man's house and his barn into the most hazardous 40 yards on the continent, if he had not thought carefully about the arrangement of things beforehand. The nearest doctor from most of those benchland claims was 50 miles in a good season. In a January storm, 50 miles was not a distance. It was an impossibility with a number attached. The people who survived in that country, who truly survived, who built something lasting and passed it on, were not the ones who arrived with the most resources or the strongest backs or the most adventurous spirits. Those qualities helped, but they were not the thing. The thing was a capacity for accurate observation under difficult conditions. The ability to look at what the land was actually telling you rather than what you had expected it to say. The willingness to admit, without too much ceremony, that the way you had always done something might not be the way the land required it to be done. Most of the people who came to Montana Territory in the 1870s and 1880s brought their methods with them from Ohio and Pennsylvania and the river valleys of Europe. Sound methods in many cases. Methods that had worked for generations in the places they came from. The land received these methods with the perfect indifference of a country that does not negotiate, and in the first bad winter it showed each family with considerable specificity which parts of their imported knowledge would hold and which parts would not. Hector and Nora Alderdice arrived in Custer County in 1879 with 60 ewes, a timber frame wagon, and the bone-deep sheep knowledge that certain families from the Welsh valleys carry the way other families carry the color of their eyes, not as a skill acquired, but as a fact of what they are. Hector could look at a ewe's fleece in March and tell you within a few weeks when she had last lambed. He could read the grass on a hillside and know whether it would support 12 animals or 14 through a dry summer. He understood wool in a way that had nothing to do with reading about it. They had chosen benchland above the river, too broken for wheat, too exposed for the faint-hearted, but carrying that good grama grass on the high ground and offering shelter in the draws when the worst weather came through. By the autumn of 1888, after 9 years of careful work and one refinancing at the land office that neither of them discussed more than necessary, they had 140 ewes, 160 acres of land that was more than half paid for, and a lambing record that had improved slowly and with considerable effort from 15% losses in the first hard year to 8% in the year before the last. 8% was the number Hector considered acceptable. It was the number Nora did not. I want to be clear about this because it matters to the story. Hector Alderdice was not a careless man, nor an unintelligent one. He had kept those sheep alive through conditions that had destroyed his neighbor's operations twice over. But 8% lamb mortality in January was, in his understanding, the fixed price of lambing in Montana. It was what the climate cost. You managed it as well as you could. You brought the most vulnerable animals into the kitchen. You checked through the night. You caught the difficult births early. But at the end of it, some lambs died of cold, and that was the nature of things. Nora had looked at those 8% for 9 years and thought, this is a problem, not a condition. There is a difference. She had not, while Hector was alive, found the solution. She had looked for it. She had read everything the Territorial Library in Miles City held on animal shelter and agricultural construction. She had observed, year after year, that the lambs she did not lose tended to come from a particular corner of the shed. She had noted it. She had thought about it. She had not yet understood what she was seeing. And then, in October of 1888, Hector came in from the north pasture with a cough that rattled in a way that was not an ordinary rattle. By November, the cough had become something that lived in his chest and would not leave. By December, it had a name, though no one said the name directly in those weeks. He died on the 14th of that month, 3 days before the season's first real snowfall, leaving Nora with the land and the flock and Clem Purdy, 17 years old, from Missouri, good-natured and willing, and entirely unprepared for a Montana winter as the only other person on the place. She was 41 years old. What happened to Nora Alderdice in the winter of 1888 and 1889 The First Winter Alone, is not a story of collapse. I want to be careful about that because people sometimes expect that part of the story, and it is not in this one. She grieved privately and worked publicly, and the two things occupied separate rooms in her, each closed to the other while she needed both. What she lost that winter, beyond Hector himself, was the accumulated knowledge that a person holds quietly in their hands after 9 years of working beside someone. Not the physical labor. She had always done half of that, more in the weeks before lambing. But the 1,000 small decisions that Hector had been making without announcing them, the adjustments and the readings of weather and animal behavior that he had learned over a lifetime and that she had relied on without knowing she was relying on them. She discovered their absence the way you discover the absence of a sound you had grown so used to that it had become the silence itself. She lost 9 lambs to cold that January. They had lost 11 the year before, 8 the year before that, 11 the year before that. The slow improvement Hector had been quietly satisfied with. 9 did not feel like progress. 9 felt, in the arithmetic of a woman who was now doing the arithmetic alone, like a problem she had been given full ownership of. She sat at the kitchen table in late February with the account book open and looked at 9 entries. The cold had finally broken. Clem was in the barn doing the morning feed. The light coming through the window was the thin, pale light of a Montana February, giving nothing. She closed the account book. She thought, I am going to solve this. Not manage it, not reduce it by a percentage that reasonable people would call acceptable. Solve it, build a solution, and trust it, and know that the next lambing season, the season after that, and the seasons after those would not take from her what this one had. She did not know yet what the solution was. She knew only that she had been looking at it for 9 years without seeing it, and that now, for reasons she could not entirely separate from grief and aloneness, and the particular clarity that sometimes comes when everything that was obscuring a thing is suddenly removed, she was ready to look again. That spring, she began to look at the northeast corner of her sheep shed in a different way. And on an October evening in 1889, standing in that corner with her palm flat against the face of a pressed hay bale, she felt something she had been passing every day for 9 years without stopping to name. Not warmth, but the absence of cold. A deep, dense resistance, as if the material had been quietly storing something during all the hours she had not been paying attention, holding it against the moment when it would be needed. She held her hand there for a long time. The neighbors heard about it by December. The first one came on a Wednesday, the week after she'd finished the first wall course, and he stood in the yard with his arms crossed in the way of a man who has already formed an opinion and is visiting primarily to deliver it. His name was Gus Reinhardt. He had been keeping sheep on the bench land west of the Alderdice place since 1872. He was not a fool, and he was not unkind, and what he said when he finally saw what she was building was exactly as reasonable as it was exactly wrong. But I am getting ahead of myself. Let me tell you what she built first. The northeast corner of the Alderdice sheep shed was not, by any ordinary measure, a remarkable thing. It was 12 feet of interior wall space where the north face met the east face, framed in sawn pine and battened on the outside against wind infiltration, the same construction as the rest of the shed. The floor there was packed earth, same as everywhere else. The roof above it caught the same weather, shed the same snow load, offered the same indifferent protection as the remaining 280 square feet of building that Hector had spent 3 weeks constructing in the autumn of 1883, and another 2 weeks improving the following spring. What made the northeast corner different was not the construction, it was the hay. Thorvald Brecka ran a hay press operation on his bottomland claim down near the river and had been selling pressed bales to the benchland ranchers since 1881. His bales were a specific thing, dense, hard-cornered, each one approximately the weight and solidity of a small trunk, compressed under a mechanical press that Thorvald had freighted in from St. Paul at a cost he still talked about with a kind of respectful grief. The bales were not like loose hay gathered in the field and forked into a mow. They were a different material in a meaningful sense, the way a cast iron pan is a different material from the same amount of iron distributed loosely. The compression had changed not just the shape, but the character of what was inside. Nora had been stacking Thorvald's bales in the northeast corner for 4 winters, because that was where there was room. Floor to ceiling, 3 courses deep along both walls, tight-fitted and square-stacked, the way Hector had stacked them, and she had continued stacking them because there was no particular reason to change it. 12 courses high, the bales formed, without anyone intending it, a dense L-shaped mass occupying 2 walls of that corner from sill plate to rafter. On the October evening in 1889, when she stood with her palm against the outermost face of those bales and felt what she felt, she had been in that shed every single day for 9 years. She had pressed her hand against those bales in the process of moving them, checking them, occasionally sitting against them during a difficult lambing. She had never once stopped to feel what she felt that evening. What changed was what she was looking for. She had been thinking, since February, about a question she could not quite bring herself to state directly, because stating it directly required admitting that 9 years of accepted practice had been 9 years of an unsolved problem wearing the clothing of an unavoidable condition. The question was this: the lambs she did not lose to cold. Where exactly were they, and why there specifically? The answer, when she allowed herself to look at the records honestly, was always the same. The northeast corner, not exclusively, not every lamb, but the surviving proportion that should not have survived by the logic of shed temperature, was year after year weighted toward that corner. She had explained this away a dozen times. More ewes clustered there. She spent more time there. The door was on the south wall, and the wind came from the northwest, so naturally the northeast corner was slightly more sheltered. All of those explanations were partially true. None of them were sufficient. She had also been reading, in the back issues of the Prairie Farmer, that Margaret Foss passed along each spring in a bundle held together with baling twine, a piece about building methods that had used a phrase she had written down in the margin of the account book where she kept miscellaneous notes. The phrase was thermal mass, and the article had explained it this way: certain materials, by virtue of their density, store heat rather than simply conducting it. A thick stone wall warmed by afternoon sun will continue releasing that warmth through the night long after the air temperature outside has dropped. A cast iron pan pulled from the fire holds its heat in a way that the same amount of iron spread thin would not. The material does not generate warmth. It holds what has been given to it and surrenders it slowly at the rate the surrounding cold demands. She had written the phrase down. She had set the issue aside. She had thought about it occasionally through the summer in the unfocused way you think about something that has not yet found its application. On that October evening, with her palm on the hay bale, the phrase and the feeling arrived in the same moment. The bales were not warm, but they had been holding the ambient heat of 20 sheep bodies for 4 winters, slowly, the way the cast iron pan holds the heat of the fire, not because anyone asked them to, not because any design had intended it, but because that was what dense compressed material did when you surrounded it with a consistent heat source and protected it from wind infiltration on 2 sides. The sheep had discovered thermal mass before she had given it a name. She stood in that corner for a long time. Then she went inside, lit the lamp, and got out the brown wrapping paper she used for calculations. What she designed that November was not complicated in principle, though it was exacting in detail. And the difference between those 2 things would matter considerably when January arrived. The principle was this: if the northeast corner was already warmer than the rest of the shed because of the hay bales along 2 walls, the logical extension was to complete the enclosure, to add bale walls on the remaining 2 sides and create a fully insulated space where the body heat of the animals inside could not escape and the cold outside could not readily enter. A room inside the room. a pocket of preserved warmth maintained not by burning fuel, but by the simple thermodynamics of dense material surrounding living bodies. She would make the outer frame 20 feet by 16 feet, using the two existing walls of the shed's northeast corner as the cold side faces. The bale walls on those two sides she would build 3 courses deep, each course of bales laid perpendicular to the face, so the insulation ran nearly 7 feet thick on the sides that faced the Montana winter directly. The interior walls, which faced only the main shed space, she would build 2 courses deep, which was sufficient since the main shed, even unheated, would moderate the worst of the cold before it reached the inner partition. Inside that insulation, the actual lambing space would measure 11 feet by 9. Small by any standard. Tight, in fact, for 20 ewes and their newborns, and 1 woman moving between them through a long lambing night. But she had calculated the heat output of 20 large ewes, roughly equivalent, she estimated, to 12 adult humans generating warmth continuously. And she had calculated the thermal mass of the surrounding bale walls, and she had concluded that the space needed to be small enough that those bodies could maintain it. A larger room would require more heat than the animals could generate unaided. A smaller room would become unworkable. 11 by 9 was where the arithmetic balanced. The floor she planned in 3 layers, each one addressing the failure mode of the one below it. A base of river sand, 4 inches deep and leveled carefully to carry moisture away from the surface and prevent it from wicking upward through freeze-thaw cycles. Above the sand, a layer of dried grass pressed flat and overlapping. A vapor break, compressible, that would prevent ground frost from traveling upward regardless of what the temperature outside demanded. Above the grass, packed clay smoothed and tamped until it held a boot print without crumbling, dense enough to absorb the body heat of animals resting on it and return that heat slowly through the night. The ceiling she would make from woven grass mats. This was the part she had not known how to do until 1887, when a Crow woman named Strikes the Ground had shown her at the Miles City market, demonstrated the technique twice, patiently, in response to a question Nora had asked with what must have been sufficient genuine curiosity to warrant an answer. The mats, woven tight and layered, would trap the rising warmth of the room in the dead air space between the mat surface and the roof above, insulating from above, the way the bale walls insulated from the sides. One wall of the lambing room, the south-facing interior partition, would have a small vent, fitted with a hinged wooden shutter. She had spent 2 evenings with the brown paper calculating the winter sun angle for Custer County's latitude, working out the exact inclination at which afternoon light would enter the vent and fall directly on a water barrel she planned to position against the opposite wall. The barrel she would paint black, 15 cents of pine tar thinned with linseed oil applied in 2 coats. A dark surface absorbs radiant heat. A surface of pale or natural wood reflects it. The barrel would collect the afternoon sun, store the heat in the dense mass of water inside, and release it slowly through the night, both warming the room and keeping the water inside it above freezing. On the brown wrapping paper, in her small, careful handwriting, she also noted the entry arrangement. A concern she had been thinking about since August. Every time the lambing room door opened, warm air would escape and cold air would enter. In peak lambing, that door might open 30 or 40 times in a 24-hour period. She designed a short vestibule. 2 burlap curtains hung 18 inches apart in the doorway, creating a buffer of room temperature air between the main shed and the lambing room interior. Anyone entering would pass through 2 hanging barriers rather than stepping directly from cold air to warm. The temperature loss per entry would be reduced from what she estimated at 11 minutes of stove time to perhaps 4. She rolled the brown paper and put it in the tin box where she kept the mortgage documents and the deed. Then she went to see Thorvald Brecka about hay bales on credit. She started building in November, after the last of the fall shearing receipts had been settled and the flock moved to winter pasture. The work happened in evenings after the feeding was done and Clem had gone in for supper, in the 2 hours of lamp-lit time before the cold of the shed made staying there impractical without the stove running, which she was not yet ready to do. The first wall course went up cleanly, the second course also. On the third evening, she stepped back to sight along the east-facing wall and found it leaning 3 inches out of plumb, not from the bales themselves, which were solid, but from an unevenness in the shed floor she had not accounted for in her base course. She pulled the wall down. She spent one evening leveling the base, packing clay into the low areas and tamping it, checking with the spirit level she had inherited from Hector's tool chest. She rebuilt the wall over 2 evenings. This is the part of building that the people who have not built things do not fully understand. The design is one conversation. The material is another. Between them, there is always a period of negotiation that does not appear in any plan drawn on brown paper, and the quality of what you build depends almost entirely on how honestly you conduct that negotiation. Nora conducted it honestly. She pulled down what was wrong and built it again. In late November, a cold snap froze the clay in her mixing trough before she could use it. 4 days of work interrupted while she waited for a warm stretch that did not come quickly. She mixed smaller batches and kept them inside the farmhouse overnight, carrying them out to the shed in the morning in a covered bucket before the temperature took them again. It added time. It was not optional. The grass mats for the ceiling were the most painstaking work. Her first attempt, woven in the evenings by lamplight from dried grass she had cut and bundled in September, produced panels that looked adequate and were not. Too loosely woven, the structure collapsing when she tested it by pressing both palms against the center. She remade 12 of them, tightening the weave until the finished panel could support her weight, distributed across it without deflecting. Strikes the Ground had shown her the technique twice. She had thought twice was enough to understand it. She discovered over 3 weeks of evenings that twice was enough to begin understanding it. The pine tar came from an observation she made in early December while watching a neighbor waterproof a section of roof on a visit to Miles City. She had been considering the problem Thorvald had mentioned to Gus Reinhardt, and that Gus, characteristically, had passed along to her as information rather than gossip about compressed hay losing density to moisture. Hay bales were not waterproof. If condensation from the animal's breathing or frost melt from the outer wall surfaces worked its way into the bale faces, the compression would relax. A relaxed bale was a less dense bale. A less dense bale was a less effective thermal mass. She bought pine tar at the hardware store. She applied it in 2 coats to every exterior face of every wall bale, the faces exposed to the cold shed air, where moisture migration would begin if it began anywhere. The pine tar sealed the surface fibers, slowed the penetration, bought the compression time it needed to hold through a winter. She noted the application in the brown paper calculations with the date and the quantities used. On the 22nd of December, she fitted the last ceiling mat, hung the 2 burlap curtains in the entry vestibule, and set the painted barrel in its position against the south wall below the vent. She moved 3 ewes inside and sat down on the floor to wait. Outside the shed, the temperature was 4 degrees below zero. Inside the lambing room, without the stove, without any fire of any kind, with only 3 sheep and the thermal mass of walls, she had spent 6 weeks building by lamplight, 31 degrees, a 35-degree difference. She lit the small stove. She fed it for 90 minutes. The room reached 51 degrees. She banked the stove, checked the vent shutter, looked at the painted barrel for a moment in the way you look at something you have built and cannot entirely believe has done what you calculated it would do. Then she went inside and slept. It was the first full night of sleep she had managed since October. She did not note this in the account book. She noted the temperatures and the stove burn time and the exterior conditions. But a carpenter who worked on that place the following April, coming to repair a cracked rafter and staying for coffee that made his back teeth ache, was told about the sleep, told it simply as a fact, the way you tell someone a thing that happened that you are still occasionally surprised by. I was that carpenter. I have thought about that night in the years since, more than she probably intended me to. The first person Nora told was Gus Reinhardt, which was the only sensible choice, because Gus was the neighbor whose opinion carried the most weight in the valley, and whose disapproval, if it came, would travel further and faster than any other man's approval. Augustus Reinhardt had come to Montana Territory in 1872 from a town in the Rhineland whose name I could never pronounce correctly despite his patient repetitions over the years. He was 63 years old in the winter of 1889, thick-built and deliberate in speech, with iron-gray hair cut close, and the kind of unhurried confidence that accretes in a man over 17 years of unbroken survival in country that had not been kind to the idea of unbroken survival. He ran cattle primarily and some sheep secondarily, and he had opinions about both that were worth hearing. He was not a man who dismissed things quickly, which meant that his dismissals, when they came, carried genuine weight. He arrived on a Wednesday morning in the second week of January, rode his gray gelding into the yard, and tied it at the post with the particular deliberateness of a man who has come to look at something and intends to look at it thoroughly. Nora had been expecting him. Word of the construction had circulated, not through any announcement on her part, but through the natural intelligence gathering of a small valley community, which requires no formal mechanism and misses very little. She walked him through the main shed first, then lifted the first burlap curtain aside and let him through the vestibule into the lambing room. He was in there for a considerable time. He touched the bale walls the way I would touch them myself 2 years later, with his full palm, held flat, reading through the material rather than merely feeling the surface. He tested the floor with his boot heel. He examined the painted barrel and its vent shutter, working the hinge twice to understand the mechanism. He looked at the ceiling mats, with his head tilted at the angle of a man who is trying to identify the technique used in their construction. He did not speak during any of this. When he was finished, he stood in the center of the small space with his hands in his coat pockets, and he looked at Nora. "It's well thought," he said. He meant it. The bale walls, that's real insulation, more than people understand, and the floorwork is sound. He paused. When Gus Reinhardt paused before continuing, the pause was not empty. "My concern is fire." He said it plainly without apology. Hay bales soaked in pine tar along one face, a sheet iron stove in the center of a room lined with compressed grass. If the fire took, the room would be unrecoverable in the time it took to unlatch the main shed door. He had seen a hay barn go in 1878, and he described it with the brevity of a man who does not require dramatic language to make a point. It was, he said, the kind of event a person does not require to happen twice in order to form a permanent opinion. Nora showed him what she had prepared, the stove positioned at maximum distance from all four walls, measured and noted in the brown paper calculations. The flue triple-sheathed through the ceiling mat with a tin collar mortared in clay, the wet burlap sack on its hook beside the entry curtain for immediate smothering of any surface ignition before it could find the walls. She had trained Clem in its use until he could execute the smothering sequence in the dark by feel in under 30 seconds. Gus looked at each element in turn. He nodded at the stove distance. He examined the flue collar. He picked up the burlap sack and felt its weight and moisture. "That's adequate," he said, which, from Gus Reinhardt, was the equivalent of considerable praise. Then he said the second thing, "Your hay reserve." He looked at the walls. "If the winter runs long, and I think this one will run long, the signs are not good, you will have lambs in March who need feed, and your feed is your walls. That is a conflict in the design." This was a harder problem, and she knew it. She had thought about it since October and had not resolved it as cleanly as she would have liked. Her intention was to maintain a separate hay supply for feeding, keeping the wall bales clearly marked and untouched. But Gus was correct that in an extended winter, the separation between wall bales and feed bales was a line drawn in intention rather than in material, and intention had a way of becoming negotiable when animals were hungry and the feed supply was running short, and there were 2 courses of perfectly adequate hay stacked right there along the north wall. She thanked him. She did not argue. He rode out of the yard with the same deliberateness with which he had ridden in, and Nora went inside and sat at the kitchen table and thought about what he had said for 3 days. On the 4th day, she rode to Thorvald Brecka's place and added 12 bales to her credit against the spring lamb sale. She brought them home on the sledge, stacked them in the main shed space as a clearly designated feed reserve, and marked each one with a chalk line so that there could be no ambiguity in a dark shed at 3 in the morning about which bales were walls and which ones were feed. The reserve was sufficient for a winter 3 weeks longer than any winter on record in Custer County. Gus's concern had made the room better. This was a thing she would say directly, years later, when people asked her about the process of building it. The people who doubted her most carefully were the ones who made the room most likely to work. She was not being generous when she said this. She was being accurate. Margaret Foss came in the 2nd week of January on a Tuesday that was clear and sharp, bringing her daughter Helene, who was 19 and curious about the ceiling construction in the focused way of a young person who has already decided she wants to understand how things are made. Margaret was 44 and had been running sheep on the benchland north of the river since before her husband Walt had died of a riding accident in 1886. She was Norwegian-American, practical in the specific way that Norwegian-American women on the Montana frontier were practical, which is to say, thoroughly, without performance, and with a calm persistence in the face of difficulty that looked like patience from the outside, but was something harder and more useful than patience from the inside. She was, in the practical terms of the valley, the person whose opinion on livestock management Nora trusted most. And she had come, Nora understood, not simply to inspect the room, but to form a judgment she would carry back to everyone who was going to ask her about it, which was everyone. Helene went directly to the ceiling mats and stayed there, working her fingers along the weave with the concentrated attention of someone memorizing a technique. Margaret walked the perimeter slowly, hands clasped behind her back, examining each wall section and the floor and the barrel and the entry vestibule in a complete circuit before she spoke. "The weave is good," she said, looking at the ceiling. "Better than I expected. Where did you learn it?" Nora told her about Strikes the Ground. Margaret nodded in the way of a woman who finds this not surprising and considers it relevant. Then she said, "My concern is the door." She explained it with precision. Nora had designed for steady-state conditions, the room temperature maintained over time, with the animals inside generating consistent warmth and the bale walls holding it. But peak lambing was not a steady state. In a hard lambing push, the door might open 30 or 40 times in a day. Each opening was a thermal event, warm air out, cold air in. Over 12 hours of active lambing, the cumulative heat loss through the door could be substantial. Had she calculated the temperature recovery time per entry? Nora said she had estimated it and had designed the burlap vestibule to reduce it. Margaret looked at the 2 hanging curtains for a moment. "Estimated," she said. The word was not unkind. It was exact. She said the other thing then, more quietly, standing close so that Helene, who had moved to the barrel and was tapping it with one knuckle, would not hear it clearly. She asked whether Nora had considered that a hard lambing push lasted 30 to 40 hours without meaningful break, moving between ewes, catching the vulnerable newborns in the first hours, watching for difficult presentations, feeding the orphans, and whether she had the management capacity alone to run the room properly at the moment it mattered most. It was not a question about the room's design. It was a question about what one woman could sustain without the person who had been the other half of her working knowledge for 9 years. Nora did not answer it immediately. She stood in the small warm space for a moment with the question in it. Margaret said, "I will come for the first 2 nights of lambing. Not because you need the help, I think you probably don't, but because I want to see how the room performs in real conditions, in actual transitions, with the door opening as it will open." She paused. "And because you should not be alone for the first night of lambing without Hector." Nora said thank you in a voice that, for the first time since the funeral, was not entirely steady. Margaret Foss put her hand briefly on Nora's arm and then stepped back and called to Helene that it was time to go. She did not make anything more of the moment than it was. She was a practical woman. Emmett pauses here in his telling. Outside the window the snow is still coming, the same steady falling snow that has been coming since morning. He is quiet for a moment before he continues. "I tell you about that exchange," he says, "because it is easy, in the telling of a story like this one, to frame the doubters as obstacles and the builder as the person who overcomes them. That is a simple story and a wrong one. Margaret Foss was not an obstacle. She was a woman who had lost her husband 3 years before Nora lost hers, who had managed a sheep operation alone through conditions that had broken men with twice her resources, and who saw in Nora's lambing room both the thing it was, a careful and original piece of practical engineering, and the thing underneath it, which was a woman in the first full year of aloneness, building something to prove to the land that it had not finished her. Margaret saw both things. She came for the first 2 nights because of both things. That is worth saying plainly. The second-hand concern about compression came through Gus. He stopped by on a Thursday in late January, ostensibly to discuss the spring pasture arrangement, genuinely to relay a conversation he had with Thorvald Brecka at the supply cooperative the previous week. He did this with the careful neutrality of a man who considers himself a conduit of useful information rather than a carrier of gossip, which was accurate and was also a distinction that Gus found more meaningful than most people around him did. Thorvald's concern was specific to his material knowledge. He had pressed hay into bales for 30 years, and he understood what moisture did to compressed grass over time. A bale that was dense and solid in November could relax, lose 15 to 20% of its compression by February if damp conditions found the interior, and the interior conditions of a lambing room in January were inherently damp. The breath of 20 sheep condensing on every cool surface, the moisture of newborn animals, the steam that rose from fresh bedding. The outer bale faces, exposed to the cold shed air, would develop frost cycles. Frost melt was moisture. Moisture was the enemy of compression, and compression was the mechanism by which the bale walls worked. Nora listened to Gus's account of Thorvald's concern, reported with admirable fidelity, she said later, and thanked him and said nothing more. That evening she went to the shed and spent 2 hours re-examining each pine-tarred bale face in the lamplight, pressing her fingers into the sealed surface fibers, looking for any gap in the application where moisture could find purchase. She found 3 sections on the lower east wall where the tar had been applied too thinly, and the fibers were still slightly proud of the surface. She recoated them twice and added a 3rd coat to the lowest course of every exterior bale face where the frost cycles would be most aggressive. She noted the additional application in the brown paper: date, quantities, affected sections. She had not spoken to Thorvald directly. She had received his concern through an intermediary and addressed it alone, by lamplight, without ceremony. This was, she would later observe, how most of the useful knowledge she had acquired in 41 years had come to her, not in clean formal instruction, but sideways, secondhand, in the form of a worry that someone else had named that she then had to solve for herself. February came cold and stayed cold, but not yet in the way that would define that winter. The temperature in the first 2 weeks of February ran between 8 above and 20 below, hard but not extraordinary, within the range that Custer County had learned to expect and had developed its customs around. Clem did his feeding runs in the buffalo hide coat, belted with rope, and said nothing about the cold, which Nora observed and appreciated. He was a Missouri boy learning Montana in the hardest classroom available, and he was learning it without complaint, which she considered the most important lesson and the one the climate taught most efficiently. She moved the first 12 pregnant ewes into the lambing room on the 10th of February. The room temperature, without stove, 36 degrees. With stove 90 minutes burning, 49. She noted the numbers. They were slightly below her November test results. The outdoor temperatures were lower. The thermal mass had not fully stabilized after the holiday period when she had kept the stove banked low. She increased the morning burn time by 20 minutes, and the temperature climbed to 53 and held. The painted barrel she checked each morning with her palm. The barrel's surface was consistently warmer than the air in the room at the moment of the morning check, which meant it had been releasing stored heat through the night, as calculated, and the vent geometry was working as the brown paper numbers had said it would work. This was the element she had been least certain about. The sun angle calculation, worked out on wrapping paper by lamplight in November, was now demonstrating itself in February in exactly the way the calculation had said it would demonstrate itself. She noted, barrel warm to palm, 7 mornings consecutive, vent geometry confirmed. She was a thorough record keeper. Hector had been thorough, and she had learned thoroughness from him, and in the first year alone she had applied that thoroughness with a particular intensity, because the records were now the only conversation she had with someone who understood what the numbers meant. The lambs were due in the 3rd week of February. Margaret Foss had confirmed she was coming. Gus Reinhardt, in his last visit, had said he would check in when the cold broke, which was his way of saying he intended to know how the room performed and would wait the appropriate distance before asking. Then, on the 4th of March, 3 weeks later than the valley's hardest winters usually arrived, the temperature dropped below zero and did not come back. Not in the morning, not by midday, when the pale sun was at its highest angle and the snow on the south-facing slopes occasionally showed a brief surface melt that passed for hope. Not by the following morning or the morning after that. The thermometer outside the farmhouse read -8 at dawn on the 5th, -12 at dawn on the 6th, -19 at dawn on the 7th. The cold had arrived. But it had not arrived as the valley had seen cold before, as a storm event, dramatic and defined, with a visible front and a trailing edge. It arrived as a condition, a settling, as if the temperature had simply decided to live at a level below what the county had formally agreed to regard as survivable and had no intention of renegotiating. Nora moved all 20 pregnant ewes into the lambing room on the evening of the 7th. She fed the stove hard for 2 hours. The room reached 54 degrees. Outside, the thermometer had dropped to 23 below. She stood in the doorway of the lambing room for a moment before going in for the night, stood in the vestibule between the 2 burlap curtains, one hand on the outer curtain, one on the inner, with the cold shed air at her back and the warm room air at her face. The 2 temperatures were so different that the boundary between them was almost physical, a threshold you could feel as you crossed it. She thought about the brown paper in the tin box with the mortgage and the deed. She thought about the 35-degree difference she had measured in December and the 54 degrees she had measured tonight, and the question that had no answer until it had one, which was, how cold does it have to get outside before the inside becomes insufficient? She did not know yet. But the cold that was settling over Custer County on the night of March 7, 1890, the cold that would not break for 17 days, that would drop to temperatures the oldest men in the valley said they had not seen in 30 years of keeping records. That cold was going to answer her question whether she was ready for the answer or not. The first lamb arrived 4 days later. She was ready. The cold that settled over Custer County in the first week of March 1890 was not, in its early days, recognizable as the thing it would become. This is worth saying, because people who were not there sometimes imagine a dramatic arrival, a sky that announced itself, a wind that warned you, some visible theater of approaching catastrophe that a person of sufficient attentiveness might have read and prepared against. The truth was quieter, and in that quietness, more final. The temperature dropped below zero on the 4th of March and did not return above it for 17 days. There was no announcement. There was only the thermometer each morning, and each morning the number was lower than the morning before. And after 4 mornings of this, the valley understood that it was not in a cold snap, but in a cold winter, and the cold winter had decided to deliver its worst at the end rather than the beginning. When the fuel reserves were lower, and the animals were weaker, and the accumulated fatigue of 5 months of hard weather management was sitting on every person in every claim in the county like a second mortgage. On the morning of the 11th of March, the thermometer outside the Alderdice farmhouse read 31 below zero. Clem Purdy, who was 18 years old that winter and from Missouri and had not yet developed the particular relationship with extreme cold that Montana required, performed his morning feed run in Hector's buffalo hide coat belted with rope and said nothing about the temperature when he came back inside. He was learning that winter to treat the cold as a condition rather than an event, to work within it the way a man works within the fact of gravity, without complaint and without the expectation that complaint would change anything. Nora observed this learning and was grateful for it. The first lamb was born on the night of the 11th. The ewe was one Nora had named, in the Welsh habit she had maintained from her family's practice, nest, which means clean in the old language, and which she had given to this particular animal 3 years earlier for no reason she could have precisely articulated. Nest was a reliable ewe, calm in labor, a good mother. The lamb was a single, a ram, vigorous at birth, on his feet, and nursing within 30 minutes of arrival. The room temperature at 3 in the morning on the 11th of March, with 20 ewes inside, and the stove banked to a slow burn, 49 degrees. The temperature outside, 31 below zero. Nora sat on the straw-covered clay floor and watched the lamb nurse. She did not celebrate. She was not given to celebration in private, and there was no one present to celebrate with in any case. She noted the temperature in the account book she kept on the shelf beside the stove. She checked the painted barrel with her palm, warm as it had been warm every morning for 7 consecutive mornings, releasing the accumulated heat of the previous afternoon's sun into the night air of the room. She checked the stove, added 2 splits of cottonwood, adjusted the damper. Then she sat down again and watched the lamb and thought about the temperature. 49 degrees, 31 below outside. 80 degrees of separation between the world and this room, maintained by bale walls and a clay floor and a painted barrel, and the bodies of 20 sheep who had been solving this problem in their own way long before she had given it a name. She did not let herself think about the previous February, or about the kitchen at 2 in the morning, or about the coffee that had still been warm in the pot because Hector had only gone back to bed an hour before. She thought about the temperature. She thought about the walls holding what they had been built to hold. This was, she would tell me 2 years later, while the coffee boiled and the April light came through the shed door at a low angle, enough. Margaret Foss came for the first 2 nights, as she had promised. She came back for 4 more nights after that, not because Nora required assistance. She did not, or not more than the lambing itself required, which was considerable but manageable, but because Margaret was watching something she had not expected to watch and could not bring herself to stop watching. She told me this herself at the general store in Miles City the following autumn, in the direct way she had of describing things she had observed. She had measured the temperature recovery after door openings, using the small thermometer she carried in her coat pocket. The lambing room, after a door entry cycle, returned to within 3 degrees of its stable temperature in 4 minutes. In the open shed, by comparison, a door opening on a 30 below night produced a temperature drop that took 40 minutes and the body heat of 18 clustered ewes to correct. She had not expected 4 minutes. She had thought Nora's burlap vestibule was a reasonable precaution. She had not understood it was the difference between a room that worked and one that merely aspired to. On the 4th night she came back, she brought her own thermometer and a small notebook and recorded temperatures at 2-hour intervals through the night. She told me the numbers she recorded. The room never dropped below 47 degrees and never rose above 56. The stove burned at a rate of roughly 8 pounds of split cottonwood per day. The barrel surface temperature, measured each morning at dawn, was consistently 4 to 6 degrees warmer than the room air, releasing stored heat from the previous day's sun with the reliability of a device manufactured for the purpose. She told me, I had told myself for 20 years that cold was the price of lambing in Montana. Not a problem. The price. The thing you paid and kept paying because there was no other currency the season accepted. Nora showed me the price was negotiable if you understood what you were actually buying. Clem performed his 2-hour check rounds throughout the 17 days without being asked to and without being thanked for it, because the asking and the thanking were both implicit in the situation, and Nora understood that unnecessary ceremony was its own kind of disrespect. He walked his 60 yards in the buffalo hide coat through temperatures that reached, on the night of the 17th of March, 41 below zero. He checked the ewes. He noted any births or signs of imminent delivery. He came back inside. On the morning of the 18th of March, his birthday, the thermometer read 44 below. Nora had made a dried apple cake the week before, and they ate it standing by the kitchen stove. Clem said it was a good cake. Nora said she was glad. Neither of them mentioned the temperature. He told me, years later at a cattle sale near Forsyth, he was 32 by then, broader in the shoulder, considerably less from Missouri in his bearing, that he had spent a long time trying to find the right words for what the lambing room felt like from the outside, walking toward it across 60 yards of 40 below darkness, with the cold pressing through every layer of wool and hide he was wearing. He said he had tried various descriptions, and none of them were accurate until he settled on the one that was. He said, "It felt like walking toward a place where people lived. Not a barn, not a shed. A place where people lived." He left the Alderdice place in the spring of 1891, when he was 19, to work a cattle operation near Forsyth. Before he went, he came to say goodbye and stood in the lambing room for a few minutes without speaking. Then he asked Nora if she would write down the vestibule dimensions so he could build one wherever he ended up. She wrote them on a scrap of brown paper and folded it twice and gave it to him. I have often thought about that folded scrap of paper traveling east toward Forsyth in a young man's coat pocket. I do not know if he ever built the vestibule. I did not think to ask him at the cattle sale, and I have not encountered him since. When the cold finally broke, on the morning of the 21st of March, the temperature climbed to 4 below zero, and the valley experienced this as warmth. Nora sat at the kitchen table with the account book and made the numbers. 31 lambs born during the 17 days, 0 lost to cold. 1 ewe lost to a breech presentation she could not correct in time. 1 lamb lost to an unwitnessed nursing failure in the first hours after birth. These losses were real, and she recorded them without softening. But cold, the thing she had set out to solve, the thing that had taken 8% in a normal year and could take 15 in a hard one, cold had taken nothing. 4 cords of split cottonwood consumed across 17 days. Her estimate of what the main shed would have required to achieve even a marginally survivable temperature across the same period was 14 to 18 cords. She had used less than a quarter. She closed the account book. She paid Thorvald Brecka in April on time, with enough left from the spring lamb sale to purchase 3 additional breeding ewes she had not been able to afford the previous year. She told Margaret. She told Gus. Clem told, by his own account, nearly everyone else. 9 families came to see the room in May. They came the way people in valley communities come to see something, not in a group, not with ceremony, but 1 or 2 at a time over the course of 3 weeks, each family having heard from the previous family and formed enough curiosity to make the ride out to the Alderdice bench land. Nora showed them all of it, the bale wall construction, the pine-tarred faces, the layered floor, the vestibule, the barrel and its vent. The brown paper calculations, which she spread on the workbench and explained in the plain terms she had been working out since February for exactly this purpose. She gave her account numbers to anyone who asked. Fuel consumed, lambs surviving, temperature differentials. She was specific because she understood that practical people are not moved by the idea of a thing, but by the arithmetic of it. By October, 7 families in the county were building lambing rooms based on her design. Not identical rooms, each one adapted to the dimensions of the existing shed, the available materials, the particular arithmetic of each family's flock. 2 used creek bank sod instead of pressed bales, taking Gus Reinhardt's fire concern as their primary design constraint. 1 used limestone rubble from a draw outcropping. The Halverson family, 3 miles north, built their room from sod and built it well by the standards of what they knew. But they did not face the interior sod walls with flat stone, and in the spring melt of 1891, the moisture worked up from the clay floor into the lower sod courses, and the east wall leaned and was abandoned before the following lambing season. Nora heard about it from Margaret. She rode out to look at what had failed. She stood in the collapsed corner with Ragna Halverson and explained what she believed had happened: the moisture path, the absence of a stone facing to break the wicking. And she was specific about what she would have done differently. She added a written note to the copy of her brown paper calculations she gave away from then forward. It said, "If using sod, face interior wall with flat stone to knee height." This is how practical knowledge actually travels in a valley community. Not cleanly, not without loss, but through failure, examined honestly and corrected in the version that comes next. Astrid Lundgren, whose family came to see the room in May of that year, looked at the ceiling mats for a long time and asked where Nora had learned to weave them. Nora said, "From a Crow woman named Strikes the Ground at the Miles City Market. She showed me twice and I practiced until I could do it well enough to trust." Astrid said she would like to learn. Nora said she would teach her what she knew, which was not everything Strikes the Ground knew, only the part she had been shown. She said this distinction mattered. I have thought about that distinction in the years since. It is the most honest thing I can record about how knowledge moves between people. It rarely travels whole. It arrives partial, shaped by the hands that carried it, missing the pieces that were never shown or never learned. Nora had taught herself to weave from 2 demonstrations and 3 weeks of evening practice. She could teach Astrid what she had managed to learn. She could not teach what Strikes the Ground had not yet finished showing her. Whether Strikes the Ground ever knew that her ceiling mats were keeping lambs alive in Custer County, whether anyone ever thought to tell her, I do not know. I have asked the question to myself a number of times over the years, and I have not found a satisfying answer, which I take to mean there is not one. Emmett is quiet for a moment. The snow outside has not stopped. The granddaughter's notepad is full on one side, and she has turned it over without his noticing. He says, "I went back to the Alderdice place in the spring of 1925, the spring after Nora's funeral. The family that owned it by then were grain farmers, no sheep, no use for a lambing shed except storage. They let me walk through it with the particular patience of people who do not understand why an old man wants to stand in their outbuildings but have decided to accommodate him anyway. The room was still there. The bales were old. The compression had relaxed over 35 years, as Thorvald had said it would, as everything relaxes over 35 years. The pine tar had held longer than expected on most faces and surrendered gradually on others. The grass mats were partly replaced, the originals gone sometime in the previous decade. The barrel was rusted through and had been set aside in the corner, but the floor was intact. The clay, tamped hard in December of 1889, worn smooth by 35 winters of animal traffic, was still there. And the walls, even with their relaxed compression, even with the long years between the last application of pine tar and the morning I was standing there, still held their shape, still stood. I put my hand flat against the face of a bale wall. It was April. The morning was cold in the way Montana April mornings are cold. Not the killing cold of February, but genuinely cold, the kind that means business. The bale surface was cool to my touch, but underneath the surface coolness, in the dense, compressed interior that no winter in 35 years had fully reached, there was still that quality I had felt the first time, not warmth, the absence of cold, a deep patience, a material that had been given something worth holding and had held it quietly, without ceremony, through all the seasons it had been asked to hold it. I stood there for a while. Nora Alderdice died in 1924 at 76 years old. She had outlived Hector by 36 years and had spent those years working the benchland with the same thorough attention she had brought to everything, until she sold the place in 1901 and moved to a smaller house near Miles City. She did not remarry. She maintained a correspondence with Margaret Foss until Margaret's death in 1917, and with Eric Brecka, Thorvald's son, who had become a building engineer and who had come to her in 1893 not to document her room, but to ask what he had gotten wrong in his attempt to scale her design to a commercial operation 4 times the size. She had told him the surface area to volume ratio changed as a room grew larger, and that his ceiling thermal mass was insufficient for the volume he was trying to heat. He went back and rebuilt it. He sent her a copy of the engineering paper he published in 1912, which cited the Alderdice lambing room in the acknowledgments. She wrote back thanking him and asking a question about moisture migration in hay bale walls that she had been thinking about for 20 years. He did not have a good answer. He wrote back to say so. The shed was torn down in 1938. The family that owned the place by then had moved to grain and had no use for a lambing structure, and the lumber was salvaged for a machine shed that was more practical for their purposes. I was told this by a woman at the hardware store in Miles City in the spring of 1939, mentioned in passing as one of those small rural facts that accumulate in the background of a landscape always in the process of becoming something other than what it was. The room is gone. The barrel is gone. The brown wrapping paper with the small, careful handwriting is gone, or if it survives in someone's attic without anyone knowing what they are keeping. But it is a cold winter outside this window. The snow has been falling since morning. 3 families in the valley have lost stock to the early freeze, and the cold has not finished making its argument. And I find that 40 years after I pressed my palm against a hay bale wall for the first and last time, I can still feel what I felt. The deep resistance, the patience of dense material that had been given warmth worth holding and had held it. The simple physics of a room that a woman built alone in the evenings by lamplight in the first winter after her husband died, on credit she was not certain she could repay, against the considered judgment of people she respected for lambs that had not yet been born. She built it before she needed it. She built it before she could prove it would hold. She built it from what she had observed and calculated and trusted. And when the cold arrived and the lambs arrived, and the 2 things met in that small space at 3 in the morning with the thermometer reading 44 below outside and 49 degrees inside, the room did exactly what she had built it to do. The best structures are always built that way, before the crisis, before the proof, before anyone believes they are necessary. Put your hand against what the earth is already holding, then build from that.